This lecture is on the Renaissance. The 14th century was disastrous for medieval European institutions. The church had lost a lot of its prestige during the so-called Babylonian captivity, in which the papacy had moved from Rome to the south of France at Avignon. The Great Schism represented a split in the church in which we had some major powers accepting the Pope at Avignon, and then some of the major powers accepting the Pope in Rome. This destroyed, or certainly undermined, the reputation of the church. Monarchs had lost power and authority. The Hundred Years' War had wrecked both the English and French kings and weakened them, and made them dependent on their barons and other wealthy segments of society. In Germany, after the demise or decline of the emperor and the death of Frederick II in 1230, it continued this decline into the 1300s. The Holy Roman Emperor was just a figurehead. In Spain, attempts by the Christian monarchs to unite the Spanish kingdom on the peninsula came to a standstill in the 1300s because the two major kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, were fighting with each other. In the midst of all this chaos, writers and scholars in Italy became aware of the vast gulf that separated them from the Roman world that had died or collapsed nearly 1,000 years before. They began to study the classics of the Roman period. The changes and developments that took place, we have come to call the Renaissance, was really only noted or described in the 1900s. The Swiss scholar Jacob Burckhardt wrote in his book, The Civilization of Renaissance in Italy, published in 1860, that the changes in attitude were represented by the writings and art of the 15th and 16th centuries in Italy constituted a new era, the Renaissance. Even though Burckhardt's ideas have come under some challenge and attack and fire in the 20th century, it is clear that there was a sharp break with the medieval way of thinking and with the artistic style that dominated the Middle Ages, and that the Renaissance of classical learning and art, in fact, had taken place. Other changes, however, were not necessarily that severe and represented more of a consequence of the changes that were taking place around the continent. Even before the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century, which killed 1/3 of the population of Europe, and the products of the natural evolution of society, economics, and politics. By the year 1400, European society was in bad shape. The plague, the confusion in the church, the attempts by the upper levels of society to protect their privileges and wealth by clamping down on a labor force that had been reduced in size and was becoming aggressive in its demands for a better life. All of this left Europe in poor condition. The next 100 years, however, would recognize a remarkable change. The papacy regained control over its destiny when it defeated the conciliar movement and reunited and returned to Rome. The monarchies of England and Spain again began the process of centralizing their kingdoms. By the 1400s, the French monarchy had recovered its balance. The economy and population of Europe had begun to grow again. Technology, as we have indicated, began to expand with the European inventors dreaming up new ways to accomplish industrial and military tasks. Europeans had become adventurous, and by the end of the century had discovered a route around Africa to the East Indies, and of course the one going west by Columbus to the Americas. All of this was set into place by the seeds planted in Italy during the most difficult years of the 1300s. During this period, Italy became the most influential area in Europe. Italians set the style in architecture, in sculpture, in painting. They dictated the literary tastes and educational philosophy that Europeans would follow for centuries. Engineering, art, politics, and business, all of these areas are segments of society that Italians appeared to dominate. And they began to also appear in northern courts and even in remote Moscow. Italian sailors were among the leaders of the great 15th century explorations. Now, there are several reasons why Italy led Europe out of the Middle Ages. One, cities had begun to flourish, whereas before the rest of Europe was being feudalized. Italian cities were left to their own devices. Feudalism was the way in which rural lords had power over the cities, and this tended to restrict the development of the cities and the cultural outlook of the cities. But that was not the case in Italy. Feudalism had never been very strong in Italy, and by the early 1300s, these feudal institutions existed in little more than name only. Two, the conflict between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor had prevented the creation of a united monarchy in Italy, which then allowed regional developments and the growth and power of the cities. Florence, Milan, Venice, all were more powerful because there was not a national government in Italy that was able to suppress their power and ambition and their aspirations. Three, in intellectual life, scholasticism was very strong in the northern universities. This scholasticism and this approach to learning never really dominated Italian thinking. Scholasticism was a means of approaching the study of nature. It was an intellectual mindset which emphasized new ways of approaching human knowledge and knowledge of God. There were different schools within the movement. Indeed, the word scholastic was a derivative of the word school, and indicated how the scholastics approached their work. Scholasticism was an attempt to explain and clarify Christian teachings by using Greek philosophy. Thinkers such as Anselm and Abelard, and the greatest of all the scholastics, St. Thomas Aquinas, attempted to synthesize the teachings of the Greeks, such as Aristotle, with divine revelation in Christianity. In giving renewed vitality to Greek thought, the medieval scholastics nurtured a very powerful force that in the hands of later thinkers in the 14th century, such as William of Ockham, would shatter the medieval concepts of nature and weaken the Christian hold on philosophical thinking. New thinkers even thought they were very religious people. New thinkers, even though they were very religious people, they began to separate religion from the framework of the natural world to open up the possibility of investigating or studying science just simply for the sake of science. Not even science as influenced by religion. 4, cities were dispersed by the plagues and the famines of the 1300s. Italian cities had large enough populations and great enough wealth and political independence to recover quickly from the disasters of that period, which more severely affected other sections of Europe, such as Paris and Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and London. The urban civilization of Renaissance Italy combined the old medieval chivalric values and the new urban values. A famous 16th century book by Baldassare Castiglione, the book was entitled The Courtier, summed up the idea of the Renaissance cultivated gentleman. According to Castiglione, the courtier possessed, or the gentlemen of the era, possessed all the chivalric virtue, power, strength, courage, skill in combat, courtesy, and all the new virtues prized by Renaissance men and women: knowledge of the classics, appreciation of art and literature, eloquence, and good taste. Above all, the desirable courtier had grace and excelled in every activity without visible effort. During the Middle Ages, courtliness was considered a result of high birth. But in the Renaissance, a courtier could come from the lower and middle classes if he were a self-made man. Renaissance society permitted considerable mobility to the talented and ambitious, rather than those who were simply well connected to the oldest and wealthiest families. Hence, Italian city-states were able to benefit from the talents of a wider segment of their populations. These gifted, determined, and upwardly mobile men in the make fascinated the people around them. A prime example of this sort of man was Francesco Sforza, who lived from 1401 to 1466, who overthrew the Visconti family to become the Duke of Milan. He founded a dynasty that lasted for a century. He recognized and supported the genius of Leonardo da Vinci and other artists such as Silvio Bartolomeo Piccolomini, who later became Pope Pius II. Men such as Sforza and da Vinci were said to have had virtu, V-I-R-T-U. This meant more than the modern word virtue. It really meant virtuosity, the combination of genius and determination that made for greatness in statesmanship, artistic creation, or literature that makes for success in the world. Eventually, the term virtue came to mean the quality that makes for success in the world. There are four characteristics that came to be associated with the Renaissance as developed in Italy. One, the first was a new ideology, individualism. Just as political states were thought to be less important than the whole of united Christendom, so the Middle Ages thought that the needs and the priorities of society took precedent over those of the individual. The honor that the Italian Renaissance gave to the individual stood that notion right on its head. The commercial economy of Italy gave people liquid wealth, which led them to move from place to place more easily than if their wealth had been tied up in land. A talented person who found the politics disagreeable in one city could move to another. There was so much wealth that the rich could employ quality scholars to teach their children or hire secretaries into the household. These scholars could carry on their work without university appointments. Therefore, the intellectual conservatism of the universities had little effect on the scholarship of the Italian humanists. This university church conservatism had a stultifying effect on the pursuit of knowledge. At the climax of Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, a fabulous book and an excellent movie which I recommend, when the librarian collapses, having been poisoned because he licked the edges of a document glorifying the use of humor in thought, a eulogy is offered by an old blind priest who is actually the perpetrator of the librarian's death because he put the poison on the pages of the forbidden volume. And he was, in fact, the old blind priest, was the author of all sorts of trauma that was taking place in the monastery. He says in that eulogy that knowledge does not grow or expand. It merely remains the same. And the task of the scholar, and the church by extension, is to repeat in a never-ending stream of sublime recapitulation. Not learn anything new, just keep repeating the same thing over and over and over. Italy was spared this conservatism. Leading families were eager to support artists and writers, and this helped them to develop their own styles and interests by drawing subsidies from many patrons. They were not subject to the tastes and interests of any of their supporters. Cellini, for instance, the sculptor and goldsmith, developed the idea that the ordinary laws of morality were made for ordinary people. They did not apply to geniuses like, of course, himself. He claimed to have been absolved of murdering a man because the people held that artists and scholars like Cellini stood above the law. The second mark of the Italian Renaissance was its predominantly secular tone. It was not pagan or anti-Christian, but it was concerned with the things of this world: business, the quality and design of houses and clothes, food and drink, and the enjoyment of leisure. In Boccaccio's Decameron, written about 1350, the characters are not irreligious or critical of Christian ideals, but they do make fun of hypocritical priests and monks. They rejoice in the triumph of clever people over clerical busybodies, and they pay attention to the affairs of the world. Renaissance writers didn't despise spiritual people, but they held those who chose the religious life to an extremely high standard of devotion. At the same time, they were in favor of people attending to business and pleasure. The presence of those two tendencies created a tension in Renaissance literature and the impression that Renaissance values were irreligious. But they weren't. They were not anti-religious, they were pro-secular. The third mark of the Italian Renaissance was its enthusiasm for the ancient or classical world. Knowledge of these classics was the mark of true gentility. Those who devoted themselves entirely to their study, the humanists, were held in high honor. As we have said, medieval scholars also studied classical literature, but they looked on the study of this type as the basis for understanding the scriptures, the writings of the church fathers, and God. Renaissance humanists studied the classics for their own sake, and whether as secretaries in the courts of Europe or teachers of the children of the elite, they had a commodity for sale, and it was a seller's market. Enthusiasm increased after 1395, when the advance of the Ottoman Turks in what is now modern-day Turkey scared scholars in Constantinople into fleeing into the West. In Italy, they found willing students of Greek language and literature. In Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici founded a Platonic academy where Greek language was taught and Greek philosophy studied. By the end of the 15th century, the 1400s, a few Italians were even studying Hebrew and Arabic. The humanists ignited a revolution in education. The main tradition from the Middle Ages was that education was to train monks and other clerics. The standards were high, but of course the range of subjects studied by such students was limited to special subjects related to Christ. Did Jesus, for instance, own his own clothes? The humanists rediscovered what Greek and Roman writers meant by the liberal arts, the liberating effect on the mind and the imagination of the study of great literature and philosophy. To this they added training in courteous behavior and athletic skill. The fourth mark of the Italian Renaissance was its sense of history. In the Middle Ages, scholars saw history divided by great events in the relationship between God and man: the flood, the Ten Commandments, life and death and resurrection of Christ. the Italian scholars recognized that the Greek and Roman culture they loved was essentially different from their own, and this fact revolutionized the European conception of the past. They saw their own work as a rebirth of classical civilization. Renaissance literature displayed the age's enthusiasm for classical literature. Scholars wrote letters, orations, moral essays, and poetry in the Roman style, but they also initiated new forms such as the sonnet and later the essay. Later in this period, the enthusiasm extended to the Greek language. When the refugee scholars who fled to the West in the 1390s had taught enough Italians to read Greek, the work of the ancient Greek philosophers became very popular. At the Plato Academy, founded by the Medici family, scholars such as Pico della Mirandola, lived from 1463 to 1499, tried to reconcile Plato and Christianity in the same way that Thomas Aquinas had tried to reconcile Aristotle and Christianity. Renaissance scholars created the basis of modern critical scholarship and analysis. This was based on careful historical analysis of ancient texts. Lorenzo Valla blew the whistle on the donation of Constantine, by which the Emperor Constantine surrendered his imperial control to the Church. By careful examination, he determined that this was a crude forgery of the early Middle Ages, not the 4th century document that supposedly had Constantine turning over the government of the Western Empire to the Pope. He also compared the Latin translation of the Bible by Jerome and found it filled with errors and distortions. The techniques he developed had great influence on later scholars such as Erasmus of Rotterdam, who produced the first critically established edition of the Greek New Testament. As to political thought, we have already mentioned Baldassare Castiglione's work, The Courtier. This work was based on Castiglione's experience at the court of the Duke of Urbino. He reformulated the idea of the gentleman and reinforced the Renaissance idea that nobility was the product of character rather than merely the birth of a person and his wealth and his attachment to the first families of a particular city. But perhaps the greatest political theorist of the Renaissance was Niccolo Machiavelli, who lived from 1469 to 1527. He combined a wide reading in the classics, particularly history, with extensive experience in political life. He served Florence as ambassador and as Secretary of State during a period in the early 16th century when the Medici were out of power. When the Medici returned to power in 1512, Machiavelli was exiled to his country estate. While in retirement, he had read widely on political history and reflected on the cause of political breakdown, how political leaders obtained and hold power, and what about that process can we learn from history. Machiavelli produced, among other things, The Prince. Here the author undertook to describe political life as it was, rather than as it should be. He analyzed the strength and weaknesses of various types of constitutions. He focused on the kinds of rulers or heads of state, how they gained and held on to power. This book became the textbook of political and diplomatic practice and was translated into many languages. The ideas are hard-headed and describe how things really are in political life. You know, this has earned him a reputation as an evil genius behind various dictators. However, it must be said that while Machiavelli believed in a strong centralized state, he did not favor dictatorship. Rather, he believed a constitution must suit the character of the people it served, and thought that an educated and sensible populace could achieve the idea of strength and unity under a republican constitution. Very soon after the humanists rediscovered Roman literature, architects copied Roman styles of building. Italy was full of Roman buildings, or at least their ruins, and architects could see the principles and design favored by the Romans. The greatest example of Renaissance architecture, of course, was the new Church of St. Peter in Rome. This church was the largest in Europe and was built by many architects, including Michelangelo, who worked on it for many years. The first characteristic of Renaissance painting was that it was practiced for its own sake. In the Middle Ages, all the plastic arts had been united in building of the churches and other types of public structures. Now painting and sculpture were no longer subordinate to architecture. Italian painters began to paint on the walls of existing churches and monasteries with frescoes, a technique of painting on fresh plaster, and they developed easel painting, which was meant to be hung in a house or a palace and to be enjoyed for its own sake. Although religious themes remained dominant, painters increasingly portrayed scenes from classical myth and literature, showing the same influence as contemporary humanists. The second characteristic of Renaissance art was the social prestige of the artists. Many of the artists were able to make a good living and became independent and honored members of society. By and large, Italy's golden age was the golden age of the artist and scholar. The third characteristic of the Renaissance was the attempt at greater realism. Painters and sculptors would study human physiology in order to capture the true emotion and understand the significant moments of the scenes they painted. For instance, in Da Vinci's Last Supper, the painter went against tradition and chose to depict not the moment when Christ told the apostles, "This is my body," but the much more dramatic one in which he announces, "One of you will betray me." This gave the painting tremendous dramatic power. Michelangelo painted the creation and chose the moment of truth to be when God brings life to Adam. Likewise, he chose to portray Moses at the moment at which he caught sight of the people worshiping the golden calf. Moses sits tense, looking out fiercely, trying to control his temper. The central concern for Renaissance artists was man, as he lived here in this world, no doubt striving with known struggles, but with great possibilities. I suggest for your reading the works of Pico della Mirandola. He said this: "O supreme generosity of God the Father, O highest and marvelous felicity of man, to him it is granted to have whatever he chooses, to be whatever he wills. Beasts, as soon as they are born, bring with them from their mother's womb all they will ever possess. On man, when he came into life, the Father conferred the seeds of all kinds and the gems of every way of life." The writers and artists of the Renaissance had not lost a belief in God, but they gave new meaning to the Judeo-Christian idea that man was made in God's image. Like God, man can be a creator, and his principal creations are his accomplishments.